Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
GSMC Podcast Network. Hope you are having a great Friday and that you have some fun weekend plans coming up. Obviously time to read, because that's what I always wish for you, is lots of time to read. But, whatever other ways you find fun. I know there are other sources of fun in the world besides reading. I just have a bit of a one-track mind. I know this. You don't have to tell me. But speaking of reading and, one-track minds, not exactly a one-track mind, but I do have another author interview for you, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode. Today I am speaking with Stephanie Kane about her new novel. It's called A Perfect Eye. And before I forget, because I forget it seems like every time I do an interview, I have copies of this book to give away. And if you would like to win a copy of this book, please listen until the end of the podcast to find out what you need to do to be entered to win a copy of A Perfect Eye by Stephanie Kane. So now that I have actually remembered to do that before I say it's time for the interview, and then I say, no, wait, like I always do, here is the description of A Perfect Eye. Some are born with a perfect palate, others with perfect pitch. Lily Sparks was born with a perfect eye. As conservator of paintings at the Denver Art Museum, she uses her keen visual powers to restore masterpieces and detect what's authentic and what is not. When the museum's billionaire benefactor is brutally murdered and Lily is dragged into the case, the grisly tableau stuns her. It's the human embodiment of the museum's prized landscape by famed impressionist Gustave Caillebotte. Oh, I think I just butchered that name. Lily comes to believe that the Caillebotte, it could be either way, I don't know. Stephanie says it multiple times in the interview, and she's right. So, and I can't remember how she said it. Terrible. Okay, so when Lily comes to believe that the painting was forged and the killer is a painter, the art world spurned. But this knowledge comes at a terrible cost. As she confronts where art ends and fraud begins, she must face the deceptions of her own past. So there is a lot that goes on in this book. It's a mystery. It is you learn a lot about art. I learned a lot about art. Lily has this perfect eye, which her father helped instill in her, and she uses that in her work in a lot of ways, and she uses it when she gets drawn into this investigation by an FBI agent that she used to have a relationship with. So she is an art conservator, but she's also kind of an investigator, because she used to be a lawyer. So she's had numerous careers, and in her role as a lawyer, she did some investigative work in terms of art forgery before, and so she is well suited for this case because of her experience, because of the eye for detail that she brings to the plate, etc. So you get the mystery, you get the art aspect, you get a little bit of romantic tension between her and this man she used to be in the relationship with, the FBI agent that she used to be in the relationship with. You get family dynamics as you learn more about her relationship with her father and what it was that caused him to instill this attention to detail in her at a very young age, because he started working with her on it when she was 5 after her mother died. And so there's a lot of layers to this book, and I love those layers. So again, it is A Perfect Eye. The author is Stephanie Kane, and let's go ahead now and let Stephanie talk about her book in the interview.
Hi, Stephanie. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here.
I am so glad to have you here, and we are here to talk about your new book, which is called A Perfect Eye. It's a crime novel. Before we get to the book, though, if you could just share a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I've had 3 careers. I've been a karate teacher, a lawyer, and a crime novelist. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I went to Colorado as a college freshman, and I stayed. After college, I owned and ran a karate studio, and then I went to law school. So I did corporate law at a big firm, and then quit that and did criminal defense. And I actually started writing novels partly as an escape from practicing law.
Wow, we could do an episode on each of your different careers, actually. I would love to hear all about owning a karate studio. That's fascinating. But do you still practice karate?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Once I stopped practicing it, I never went back to it.
You never went back. Oh, fascinating. Well, we are here to talk about your career as an author. So the new book is called A Perfect Eye. If you could give just an overview of the story.
Sure. Well, the heroine, Lily Sparks, is the conservator of paintings at the Denver Art Museum. And from the time she was a little girl, her dad trained her to be very observant, to have a perfect eye. So when the museum's chief patron is killed, Lily's eye tells her the killer was inspired by one of the museum's prized paintings, which is an impressionist landscape by Gustav Caillebotte. And so Lily, of course, goes after the killer.
Yes, and yes, it's definitely one of the more unique premises that I've read. You know, you've got so many different aspects between the art and Lily's perfect eye, plus then the murder and the mystery. So I found that just a really fascinating combination. But what about Lily, the main character, do you think might resonate with readers?
Well, one reason I made Lily an art conservator is because I wanted her to actually do something, not just live in her head. And what an art conservator does is that they work hands-on with paintings to clean and repair and restore them. So unlike ordinary museum visitors like you and me who have to stand a foot or two away, conservators get to physically touch the art. So I think one thing that will resonate about Lily is she's passionate about her work. She worked really hard to get where she is, and she's passionate enough about it that she'll butt heads with higher-ups at the museum, even at the risk of losing her job. Another thing about Lily is she doesn't depend on men to bail her out. When she goes after the killer, she doesn't expect anyone to come to her rescue. And also, she's still in love with a guy who broke her heart. So who can't relate to that?
Yes, absolutely. And a big part of her character is that eye for detail. So let's talk a little bit about that aspect because it really comes from her relationship with her father. So can you flesh that out a little bit more?
Yeah, and I'm really glad you asked that because that is actually the foundation of her character arc. So actually what happened is after Lily's mother died, she was raised by her father. And when she was 5, he started taking her on neighborhood walks to teach her to be observant and to remember what she saw. He made it into kind of a game with them retracing their steps and him asking her if anything had changed. And all of that was to hone her eye. So what starts out as a way to bond with her father becomes a talent that sets her on her path to becoming an art conservator. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself why a parent would train his daughter to do that.
Yes.
Is it to protect her or maybe distract her from something he doesn't want her to see? So that question really is the foundation for her character arc, because what she learns about her own past in the course of solving the murder will change her forever.
Ooh, I think that's the perfect time to go to our first break. You know, it's kind of like a cliffhanger. It will change her forever. Well, why? How? What's going on? We will talk more about A Perfect Eye with Stephanie Kane after this break. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. You know, I was smug about remembering to talk about the giveaway, and the universe then reminded me I shouldn't be smug because I realized that I did not introduce myself at the beginning of this podcast. I normally say, I am your host, Sarah. And I assume if you're a regular listener of this podcast, you have figured that out after 182 episodes. But what if you're new? If you're new, you'd be like, who is this person? Even though her name's in the show notes. But yeah, I didn't introduce myself, so I apologize for being rude like that. Let's go ahead and get back to the interview, and I will try not to forget other things.
Yeah, that's, like I said, there's so many layers to the story. I really like that. You just never quite know what's coming next. I really appreciated that. Because there are so many different layers. From it, Lily's a little bit like you in that she, this is her second career. She was a lawyer, so she brings that to the table as well. She's got a lot going on. Lily does.
Well, there is an autobiographical element to the book, and as you say, before she was an art conservator, she was a lawyer, and of course, before I was a novelist, I was a lawyer. But it's a little bit more personal than that in this way. When I was 40, a bit older than Lily, I went back to college. I was a partner at a law firm. And I went back to college to study physics and chemistry so that I could apply to med school. I didn't get in, and I had to go back to law. And I couldn't go back to the big fancy firm where I'd been a partner at because by then I had resigned my partnership. So I had to go back to, my criminal defense lawyer was actually the only one who would hire me. And he paid me, like 10 or 15 bucks an hour. So I know how it feels to leave something you're good enough at to earn a living for something that is completely unknown and then fall flat on your face. Lily wasn't afraid to take that risk. So the autobiographical element runs a little bit deeper than, just our shared past as a lawyer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And are you, do you know a lot about art, or did you have to research that part of the book?
Oh, I have absolutely no training in art. And so I had to start from scratch. But luckily, I am a research junkie. First, I read, I had to find an artist that would be the inspiration for, the murder in the book. So when I decided it would be Gustav Caillebotte, the impressionist painter whose landscape inspired the murder, I read everything I could get my hands on about him. And then I started reading everything I could find about art conservation, impressionist painting technique, the museum world, art fraud, everything. I went to museum lectures, I interviewed art conservators and curators and docents, and I visited conservation labs. And then I turned to art forgers. So there's two aspects to pulling off a successful forgery. The first is perfecting the real artist's technique. And the second is creating a false chain of title so that the painting looks like it was lost and has just been rediscovered. So I started looking into forgers. And I read up on the famous ones, and finally I found one who fit my bill. His name is Eric Hebborn, and he was a British painter who trained at the Royal Academy of the Arts, and he forged old master drawings. He wrote a manual for forgery called The Art Forger's Handbook. And the thing about Hepburn is that he loved to talk about himself. So he was interviewed extensively on YouTube. And I watched his interviews, and they gave me his mannerisms and really some critical insights into his mentality. So he became the model for the bad guy in A Perfect Eye. And actually, Hepburn met a very bad end. He was murdered on a street in Rome right before his book, The Art Forger's Handbook, was published, and that murder is unsolved. But these forgers tend to meet bad ends, and they run afoul of all sorts of people.
Right. In that case, truth is probably a little stranger than fiction for his life. Just the fact that he wrote a manual on it and got it published, I find fascinating. Yes.
It's a fascinating book because it doesn't just give a window into his mentality. I mean, he provides recipes for making period authentic ink by boiling acorns. I mean, it's incredible. Wow. And he says where you can find canvases that are hundreds of years old by combing the flea markets throughout Europe. I mean, he just, and then he talks about how he perfected his technique. He just lays it all out there. And actually, he's a really good writer. I mean, I was surprised at how good a writer he was.
Wow, that is fascinating, and I love that you read the book even.
Oh yeah.
So
there's no rabbit hole that's too deep for me to run down.
I love it. Well, I don't know much about art either, and so I read the book with my phone next to me so that I could Google paintings that you were talking about throughout the book, so that I would have a better idea. So that was kind of fun. I got to learn a little bit more.
Well, that was one of the fun parts for me too. Because it was so visual. And I'd written earlier books starring a criminal defense lawyer. They were legal thrillers, and I basically just drew on my own legal background. But there was nothing graphic or visual about what a lawyer does. So the whole element of art just informed. I mean, it juiced me up, is really what I should say. That it was just so visual.
So was the art kind of your inspiration for the story, or how did it come about, this mixture of art and thriller and law, etc.?
Well, let me just address the law thing. Well, first of all, the art world was so foreign to me. I mean, I love going to museums. When my husband and I travel, we always go to art museums. We have a lot of art in our house, but I have zero training in it. And I'm the kind of person who goes to a museum and looks at the paintings but doesn't read the labels, So I really have zero exposure to the art world beyond that. And so I gave Lily a legal background, not that she uses it at all in the book, or hardly at all, just to give myself a little bit of something that was familiar to me, that I could maybe fall back on as a writer, because I was creating a world that was completely new to me. But Lily was actually inspired by a real person, a woman named Amy Herman, who is an art historian who wrote a book called Visual Intelligence. Herman teaches med students, lawyers, cops, and FBI agents to be more observant by studying paintings in museums. I thought that was a totally cool skill set for a detective. So it sort of married my love for museums with, an interesting kind of detective. So that was really, there was sort of a joint inspiration for it.
Absolutely. That's really cool. You have written, you mentioned the crime or the legal thrillers. How many books have you written so far?
This is the fifth book that I have published.
Okay. And did you want to take this time to highlight any of the other books, or do you just want to focus on the? Okay.
I'm glad you're asking that. As I mentioned before, Lily, I wrote a series of legal thrillers starring a dyslexic criminal defense lawyer named Jackie Flowers. And the hook with Jackie is that she was actually a better lawyer because she couldn't read or write, or had difficulties with reading or writing. But one of her books, Extreme Indifference, is a real favorite of mine. And it is about the effect that our daily indifference has on the people around us. It won a Colorado Book Award and a Colorado Authors League Award, but that's not why it's important to me. Extreme Indifference is the only book I threw out when it was 100% complete. I was under a deadline from my publisher, Scribner, but I rewrote it from scratch after I saw something happen in a courtroom that was much more compelling than the story I originally wrote. That was real. My story wasn't. And it was a much more powerful springboard for a story about a judge's indifference to the effects his rulings have on the people in front of him in court than the story that I'd written. So Extreme Indifference taught me a really important lesson. It taught me not to spit out a story, but to truly care about the ones I tell. Because if they don't matter to me, how could they possibly matter to readers? Right. So I learned a lot from that experience, and that book is very dear to me because of that.
Absolutely. That's really amazing. I mean, I know a lot of people would not want to do that, would not want to say, I'm going to redo this because it's not quite right and it's not what I want it to be. They'd be like, it's done. I'm going to move on. So that's really impressive.
Well, you have to remember that your books hopefully will survive you. Yeah. And if each one doesn't represent the best that you can give to a reader, why write it? Why put it out there?
I'm actually going to let you ponder that question while we take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll have the conclusion of this interview. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I'm speaking today with author Stephanie Kane about her new novel, A Perfect Eye. And before we went to the break, Stephanie was saying how, it's important to put your best work out there and put something out that you would want to read yourself, etc. So just wanted to remind you of that, since my follow-up question ties directly into what she was saying. So let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
And speaking of the best that you can do and putting things out there, you mentioned before we started recording that you got some good news.
Yeah, I just opened the newspaper this morning and got the thrilling news that A Perfect Eye just made the Denver Post bestseller list.
That was awesome.
That was very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you found out from the paper? You didn't know that?
Nope.
It was
read the paper.
Well, it's a good thing you read the paper then.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. In terms of writing, are you working on anything new now?
I'm working on a sequel to A Perfect Eye, again starring Lily and set at the Denver Art Museum. Okay. And this time the artist is Edward Hopper. He is the mid-20th century American realist who painted lonely people in diners and apartments and hotel rooms. You might know him from, he has a very famous painting called The Nighthawks, which is a diner that's lit from the inside, and you're looking through the window from the street, and there are couple of people sitting there drinking coffee late at night. Another very famous painting of his is called The Automat, and it shows like a woman in 1930s garb sitting drinking coffee alone in an automat at night. So there's just something about him, the isolation and loneliness of his subjects that has really, frankly, always given me the creeps. So that's a good start for a writer who wants to write a mystery, to have something that's giving you the creeps as the inspiration. So that's what I'm working on.
Okay, thank you. And you said that you started writing kind of to distract yourself from practicing law. Had you always thought about writing before that, or did it really just come later in life to you?
Well, as a kid, I loved to read. And I also liked to write. I went to public school in New York, and you were always having to write these little composition books with, stories as if you were a little pioneer girl or something like that. And, I always enjoyed doing that. And my family was really big readers. We'd go to the library, we'd go to a used bookstore, but everyone in my family was always reading. So I love to read, but I never imagined becoming a writer myself. When I was a lawyer, I wrote contracts and briefs, but it never occurred to me to write a book until I had a story I wanted to tell. So unfortunately in college, I never took a creative writing course. And when it came time to start to write, or to try to write, I had to sort of be self-taught. And so I started with reading a ton of craft books and experimenting, and my first novel, Quiet Time, became sort of a laboratory for learning how to write fiction. It went through about 21 drafts. Those are just the ones that I, kept copies of on disc. It probably went through many, many more than that. And I started going to conferences and learning from other people, and gradually I learned. I know there's got to be much easier ways to do it than that, but that's just sort of my own process.
Well, I was just thinking it makes sense if you are a research junkie. This was kind of right up your alley. You jumped in and you did what you do and learned a lot, I'm sure.
There's much faster routes than that, but you've got to you've got one thing I've learned basically from my writing career and coming back to it after having not published for a while is I've learned to respect my own process. It's going to be different for every writer. And a lot of it is based on, what your strongest learning channels are, what your habits are, all sorts of things. And I've just learned that, other people might do it faster or in a different way, but I have to approach it in a way that is sort of the way I'm wired to do it. And when I went back to writing, I'd taken a few years off. I was just shocked at one of the things that sort of took me by surprise was how many books there were out there and how many people out there were thought they had the secret to writing a bestseller. I mean, you can just Google it. There's lots of books about it. And it's almost as if people, in fact, some people did find or create sort of an algorithm for it. And I was initially seduced by that because, wow, there had to be a better, quicker way than I write, and if this was the wave of the future, I just, better jump on the bus, And for a while, I got very sidetracked with all that until I finally realized that it just wasn't the way I think, and writing is just one of the end results, one of the products of the way you think. So it really didn't work for me. And for a while, it really messed up my writing. And then I sort of stepped back and reminded myself of why I write. It's not to, even though I'm thrilled that I'm on the local bestseller list today with the Denver Post, it's not my main motivation for writing. So, I stepped back and reassessed and, I changed my process a little in ways that made sense, because you always have to be open to, better ways of doing things. But I basically realized that I had to honor the way I think.
Yeah. And I kept thinking while you were talking, I mean, you have to find what works best for you. And I kept thinking about, you mentioned the main character of your previous series, who is a lawyer who's dyslexic. And I really, I haven't read that series, but I really appreciate that you included a character that has, some people might see it as a disability, but she finds ways to make it work, it sounds like, and to be a great lawyer, or a good lawyer, or whatever kind of lawyer she is.
I made her a better lawyer than me.
Okay.
Yeah. And the inspiration was a young relative of mine who has dyslexia, and I watched him grow up. I watched him basically get battered by an educational system that rewarded the things he didn't do well, and not the things that he did do well. And he survived it and became a very successful engineer and a strong reader. And that intrigued me. So I had a website, and I posted a questionnaire on it that was directed to learning disabled people and their friends and families and teachers. And I asked them a whole bunch of questions about how it affected their creativity, what the challenges were and what their successes were. And that became a large part of the research for that character. And one of the questions I asked on the website was, where is the greatest need? And a guy wrote back to me and said he thought that there was a lot of attention starting to be paid to children, but there was also a great need for learning disabled adults like himself. So I volunteered at a literacy program, and for 6 months, I tutored 2 learning disabled adult men, one-on-one, not at the same time, for 2 hours a week for 6 months in reading. And so, I got a little bit of the sense of what it was like. And also their successes. One woman wrote into my website, a lawyer, and she said she had passed the bar exam by memorizing legal theories, by making them into jingles. So she made songs for herself. And also one of the foremost lawyers practicing in the United States today is a guy named David Boies, and he is dyslexic. So it has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence.
No, absolutely not. And I really appreciate the time that you put into that, but also the fact that you did make a main character who's a little bit different, because representation matters, and people need to see themselves in the books that they read.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So, you are, as you've said, a voracious reader. Do you have favorite authors or genres, or is that too big of a question?
Well, I really read very, very widely. And when I'm working on a book, I don't read fiction because it's just too distracting. I just read, a ton of nonfiction that's relevant to what I'm working on. But I really like just about all varieties of crime novels and psychological suspense. Anything that gets into why people do what they do. Historical crime books grab me too. There's a guy named Paul French who writes about crime in very unusual settings. And one of my favorite books is a book he wrote called Midnight in Peking. It's the true story of a murder in 1937 of a British diplomat's daughter in Peking, and it's set at the brink of World War II, just before the Japanese invaded. And boy, does he do a fantastic job setting the stage. I just love that book. And Denver is a very, very rich writing community, and there are great authors locally too, like Harry McLean and Mark Stevens, and I just love their books. It's a really vibrant place to be a writer. So I'm very lucky in that regard.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you for that. And I know you have a website, So if you could give the address of the website and where people might find you on social media, if you have it.
Sure. My website is Writer Kane. That's WriterKane.com. And on my website, you will find a blog called Cold Case Story Blog. The blog is about a murder that happened in 1973 and was reopened as a cold case 30 years later. I'm also on Facebook at author Stephanie Kane, again with a K, and I'd love for people to visit me there.
All right, thank you so much. And we've talked about a lot of different topics, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like for people to know about this new book or any writing topic we haven't covered?
Yeah, I'd like you might be interested in a little piece of advice that I have for aspiring authors. I don't want to sound too old or preachy here, but It's something I've given a lot of thought to. And if I was going to give one piece of advice to aspiring writers, it would be write something you care about. We've already touched on this, but don't try to write to the market or in a style or voice that isn't your own. Take the time to learn the craft. Respect your own style of learning. If you like conferences and retreats and critique groups, go to them. If you're more comfortable, like me, studying on your own, there is no shortage of really good craft books and online resources. But at some point, you'll need personal feedback from real readers. Find the ones who appreciate your work and want to help you make it better. And then listen to them, because those people are priceless. And I have a couple in my life, and I cannot begin to tell you how much I value their feedback, because I know that they're trying to make my books better, and they have. So, I acknowledge them, and that can't begin to express the gratitude that I feel for them. So at any point in your career, you may come across one of these wonderful human beings. And when you do, don't take them for granted. Don't be angry if they criticize your writing or your story. As long as you know they want to help you make it better, they are just priceless. So watch for them and thank them.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And thank you again, Stephanie, for taking the time to talk to me about your new book, A Perfect Eye, as well as your other books. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks a million. I've enjoyed it very much. You asked good questions.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you once again to Stephanie for taking the time to talk to me about her new novel, A Perfect Eye. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, in all of my smugness, I do have copies of this book to give away. So if you are interested in mysteries, in kind of a crime novel, but with a different sort of protagonist instead of your normal kind of police officer or investigator, Lily definitely is not quite your typical protagonist in that light. If you're interested in the art world, or if you want to learn a little bit more about the art world, then you should definitely enter to win a copy of A Perfect Eye. All you have to do is go to our social media pages, GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can find those on our website. You can find them in the show notes for this episode, or you can just type in GSMC Book Review and they will come up. So just go to GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Comment on this post, which is episode 182, interview with Stephanie Kane. And let's this week comment on your, I've been trying to shake it up a little bit. In the comments, give me your favorite childhood book. I would love to hear that, because then it's just going to add to my TBR list. It's all about me, clearly. No, not really. I would love to hear about your favorite childhood book. So go to social media, comment on this episode, which is 182, and tell me the name of your favorite childhood book, if you can pick just one. You can list multiple if you need to. So thank you again to Stephanie. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. Again, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I hope that you find some time to get lost in a good book.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.